People assumed it was just another forgotten trapper's shelter, but anyone who slept inside it during winter walked away confused. Because while the thermometer outside might read 30 below zero, inside that strange metal shell, it stayed warm enough to sit in shirt sleeves. No roaring fire, no constant feeding of wood through the night, just a curved metal roof and a man's quiet conviction that the world had been building houses wrong for a very long time. His name was Ken Kern, and in the early 1970s, in the high desert country near Oakhurst, California, he was trying to solve a problem that most people didn't even know existed. He wasn't an architect. He wasn't formally trained in engineering. He was a builder and a thinker who had spent years watching people pour their savings into homes that leaked heat like sieves. Homes that demanded constant energy, constant money, constant attention just to stay livable. Kern had written a book in 1972 called The Owner-Built Home, and it had quietly spread through the Back to the Land movement like a rumor. It wasn't a glossy manual. It was dense, hand-illustrated, filled with calculations and historical examples, and a kind of patient frustration with the construction industry. He believed that ordinary people had been convinced they needed experts to build shelter, and that this conviction had made housing expensive and often poorly designed. But books are one thing, living in your own experiment is another. The structure he built didn't look like much from the outside. It was a small cabin, maybe 20 feet across, with walls made from stacked cordwood and mortar. But over the top of it, Kern had placed a Quonset hut roof. Not a decorative arch, an actual salvaged military Quonset, the kind that had been mass-produced during the Second World War and then abandoned across the American landscape. Most people saw them rusting in fields or repurposed as cheap storage sheds. Kern saw something else. He saw thermal mass. He saw a shape that could shed snow and wind without struggle. He saw a way to capture and hold the sun's heat in a climate where winter nights dropped fast and hard. The cordwood walls themselves were an old Scandinavian technique, simple and thermally efficient. You cut logs into short lengths, stack them like bricks with mortar in between, and the wood itself acts as insulation. The air pockets slow the transfer of cold, the mass holds warmth. But Kern wasn't satisfied with that alone. He wanted to push further. So he insulated the Quonset hut roof heavily, far beyond what anyone thought necessary. He angled the structure to catch the low winter sun. He thought about airflow and moisture and the way heat rises and gets lost through conventional roofing. And when he was done, he had a building that held 55 degrees Fahrenheit warmer inside than the outside air, often without any active heating at all. 55 degrees. That's not a small difference. That's not a marginal improvement. That's the difference between frozen pipes and comfort, between burning cords of wood every week and barely needing a fire, between a house that fights the climate and one that works with it. People didn't believe him at first. Visitors would arrive skeptical, bundled against the cold, and then stand inside in confusion as they slowly peeled off layers. The math didn't seem possible, but the thermometers didn't lie, and neither did the people who spent nights there. The building worked, and it worked in a way that made conventional construction look wasteful and stubborn. If stories like this matter to you, you may want to stay till the end. But the question that hung in the air, the one Kern himself must have asked, was whether anyone else would listen. Because proving something works in your own backyard and convincing a world to change how it builds are two very different things. And the world, as it turned out, wasn't quite ready.
Kern wasn't the first person to experiment with alternative building methods, but he might have been one of the most methodical. He approached construction the way a scientist approaches a hypothesis. He tested materials. He measured results. He read histories of vernacular architecture from around the world, looking for techniques that had worked for centuries before industrialization convinced everyone that stick framing and drywall were the only rational options. The Quonset-Covered cabin wasn't his only project. Around the same property in Oakhurst, he built other experimental structures, each one testing a different principle. He tried stone, he tried adobe, he tried different roof pitches and window placements and thermal storage ideas. He documented everything, recording temperatures, costs, labor hours, failures. He was building a library of knowledge, one structure at a time, and he shared it freely with anyone who asked. But the cabin with the Quonset roof became his most famous example, partly because the results were so undeniable. When winter came to the Sierra Nevada foothills, temperatures could drop well below freezing for weeks at a time. Conventional homes in the area ran their heaters constantly. Propane bills climbed. Wood stoves devoured fuel. People accepted it as the cost of living in a cold climate. Kern's cabin didn't accept it. The design created what he called a thermal envelope, a buffer zone where the Quonset roof acted as both shield and insulator. The cordwood walls, thick and dense, absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night. The mass of the structure worked like a battery, storing energy from the sun and from the minimal heating he did use. The curved metal roof, far from being a liability, turned out to be an advantage. Snow slid off easily, wind passed over it without finding edges to cry at, and the insulation he'd packed above it held heat inside instead of letting it bleed into the sky. The temperature difference he measured, that 55-degree gap, wasn't at one time fluke. It was consistent, repeatable, real. And yet, when people came to see it, their reactions were mixed. Some were inspired. They took notes, asked questions, went home and started their own experiments. Others were dismissive. They called it a novelty, a fluke, something that might work for one eccentric builder but could never scale. The construction industry, already deeply invested in standardized methods and materials, had no interest in Quonset huts or cordwood or owner-builders who bypassed contractors and architects. Kern understood the resistance. He'd written about it. In The Owner-Built Home and his later work, he talked about how the housing industry had become a system designed to extract maximum profit, not to provide maximum shelter. He wasn't naive about the economics. He knew that banks didn't want to finance unconventional homes. He knew that building codes, written in partnership with industry lobbyists, often made alternative methods illegal or prohibitively difficult. He knew that most people, even if they were curious, didn't have the time or confidence to build their own homes. But he also believed that knowledge, once shared, couldn't be fully suppressed. And so he kept building, kept writing, kept inviting people to come and see for themselves. The cabin stood as proof, not proof that everyone should build a Quonset-covered cordwood home, but proof that the assumptions underlying conventional construction were not inevitable, that there were other ways, that energy efficiency and comfort didn't have to be expensive or complicated, that a thoughtful person working with simple materials and old principles could create something better than what the market offered. And for a while, in the 1970s and early 1980s, it seemed like maybe the world was starting to listen. The energy crisis had made people aware of waste. The Back to the Land movement had made self-sufficiency fashionable. Kern's books sold steadily. His idea spread through networks of builders and homesteaders and quiet rebels who wanted out of the system. But movements are fragile things, and the question that lingered, even as visitors stood in that warm cabin and marveled, was whether this knowledge would take root, or whether it would remain a footnote, a curiosity, a thing people admired but never quite acted on.
Ken Kern died in 1987. He was 58 years old, and by then he'd written several books, built dozens of experimental structures, and influenced a generation of alternative builders. But he died without seeing his ideas become mainstream. The construction industry continued on its path, and most homes continued to be built the way they'd been built for decades, with minimal insulation, poor thermal design, and a reliance on constant energy input to stay comfortable. The cabin in Oakhurst, though, didn't disappear. It stood for years, a quiet testament to what was possible. Some of Kern's other structures deteriorated or were dismantled, but the Quonset-covered cabin remained, and people who knew about it still made pilgrimages to see it. They'd stand inside, feel the warmth, check the thermometer, and shake their heads at how simple it all was. Because that was the thing that bothered people most, perhaps. Not that it was complicated, but that it was simple. That the solution to cold homes and high energy bills wasn't some expensive new technology, but a combination of old techniques, careful design, and a willingness to think differently. It suggested that the problem had never been a lack of knowledge, but a lack of will. Kern had understood that most people wouldn't build their own homes. He knew that his approach required time, confidence, and a tolerance for uncertainty that not everyone possessed. But he also believed that even if only a small percentage of people took up owner building, it would be enough to change the conversation, enough to prove that alternatives existed, enough to put pressure on the industry to do better. In some ways, he was right. The principles he championed, passive solar design, thermal mass, natural materials, super insulation, have become more common even if they're rarely credited back to him. Modern green building codes incorporate ideas he was testing in the 1970s. The tiny house movement, the natural building movement, the emphasis on energy efficiency, all of it echoes arguments he made decades ago. But in other ways, the world moved on without him. Most homes are still built conventionally. Most people still hire contractors and follow standard plans. The systems Kern critiqued, the banks, the codes, the industry standards, are still in place, still shaping what gets built and how. The cabin itself, reports suggest, eventually fell into disrepair. The property changed hands. The Quonset roof, tough as it wasn't immortal. Cordwood walls need maintenance. Without someone to care for it, even the best designed building will fade. But the idea didn't fade. The measurements didn't fade. The fact that a man in the California foothills once built a small shelter that stayed 55 degrees warmer than the outside air, using salvaged materials and old techniques, that fact remains. And it raises a question that still hasn't been answered, not really. If it was possible then, with limited resources and no institutional support, to build homes that were radically more efficient and comfortable, why is it still so rare now? Why do we still accept buildings that waste energy, that cost more to heat and cool than they cost to build, that trap us in cycles of debt and dependence? Ken Kern thought the answer was that we'd forgotten how to think for ourselves, that we'd handed over the most basic human need, shelter, to a system that didn't have our best interests at heart. He believed that reclaiming that knowledge, learning to build again, was an act of freedom. Whether he was right or not, the cabin stood as evidence, and evidence, once it exists, is hard to ignore forever.